The numbers speak for themselves. 1 out of 5 of the world's inhabitants is Chinese. Today, China is the second largest consumer of oil, just after the United States. But with one of the highest rates of growth on the planet, its energy needs are increasing 7 times faster, while its reserves are depleting. China is unable to produce the oil it needs today. It has to import half of it. In the next 3 years, this number will increase to 2/3. If not, its whole economy will collapse. Hence, it's imperative to find new countries to provide it and secure these supplies in an increasingly unstable world. In this crusade for black gold, China is already in direct conflict with the current, but who knows for how long, greatest consumer of the world's oil, the United States. The battle for oil has begun. Beijing, April 2007. Today is the inauguration of the 8th Oil Equipment Manufacturers Exhibition, which brings together all the world's major companies in that field. 30,000 visitors, 42 countries represented. The companies here are offering all the equipment necessary to produce black gold, from drills for sea exploration to pipelines and to the latest generation of super tankers. And buyers from all over the world are here too. A quick look at the exhibition's clientele provides a snapshot of the new oil alliances which China is establishing across the world.
Daily, or I can say annually, the business between China and Sudan is increasing and jumping. And I think in China here there is a huge opportunities. The new technology and advanced technology start to be implemented in China. And also you can get a very good price in China also. This is one of the advantage why the people visit China.
We have some problems, political problems with Europe and US, but with China, with Asia, relationship between Iran and India, China is easy, better than Europe and US, and it's very better for us.
It is being sold today in India also, and worldwide by the American companies, basically manufactured in China. What they are doing, they are putting the stamp in Houston on Chinese product and selling it as an American product. So why not to shake hand directly?
Zhao Ziming is the exhibition's organizer. A former administration officer, today he is the Chamber of Commerce's chairman for the equipment manufacturers.
每年4月份，我们这个展览会
The exhibition takes place every year in April, with a larger and larger display and more participants from different countries.
应该说这样，随着我们国家经济高速的发展
Our economy is developing spectacularly. I think that in the coming years, Chinese growth will maintain a rate of 8%.
8%左右的这样的增长速度，是吧？
But at such a rate, its energy needs are considerable.
能源的需求，从目前国内的
Today, oil and gas production in our country is unable to respond to our needs.
进口。当然，这个进口这是一个方面。
Hence, we have an absolute imperative, on the one hand to import, and on the other to increase collaboration with foreign countries.
石油公司的合作。
The face of the Chinese capital reflects the country's profound economic changes. In the last 20 years, the number of cars in the country has been multiplied by 90. At this rate, in 2030, China will produce more of them than the United States. With such growth in a country not yet organized to face such needs, energy shortages are frequent. Electricity blackouts are common, and ruptures in petrol stocks disrupt daily life and the running of companies. Taxi drivers have long grown accustomed to queue up early in the morning at the gas station.
Is it like this every day?
To begin work at 8 o'clock, we have to be online by 6. There's a terrible shortage. The situation has been difficult for a month, but the regional government is trying to resolve the problem.
It's a problem with our job. Without petrol, it's difficult to work as a taxi driver. We have to queue, we waste time.
For the last 2 weeks, it's been difficult, but we've had this problem for a long time.
Is there a lack of petrol in the city?
There's a lack of petrol in all of China.
As a military wing to the Chinese state, 3 major oil companies were created at the end of the 80s, with the target of providing the country with sufficient financial clout to penetrate the international hydrocarbon market. The China National Offshore Oil Corporation, the SNOOP, China National Petrochemical Corporation, Sinopec, and the largest among them, the China National Petroleum Corporation, the CNPC. Altogether, these 3 companies employ tens of thousands of people across the globe and hundreds of traders in London, New York, and Singapore markets in order to acquire the astronomical quantities needed by the country. Forced to find external sources, China has launched a world conquest. Every country that has oil resources is in its line of fire, and in the front row, Africa. Nearly 10% of world production comes from the African continent, but above all, it's there that the most recent discoveries have been made. China is one of the latecomers, hence its president, Hu Jintao himself, travels to every corner of Africa in search of new contracts. And he carries what it takes to tempt the continent's leaders.
Chinese companies are very active in Africa. I mean, they would come to a place like an African country and say, okay, in addition to the oil deal, we're also going to build a telecommunication system. We're also going to build you a railway system or a new port. We're going to throw in the money. Now, this is something that a company like Total or BP cannot do. So the reality is that the companies that are multinational companies, that are transparent, that are companies that abide by the law, find themselves playing against a very different animal, against companies that play according to a very different set of rules. And as a result, they lose almost every deal.
Chad entered the club of oil producers 4 years ago. With the rise of the barrel's cost, the country has since enjoyed a veritable financial windfall, $1 billion only for this year. Nonetheless, the population remains one of the poorest on the planet. A consortium of Western companies, principally American, exploits most of Chad's subterranean reserves. In keeping with its strategy, China is now making its presence felt in the country. Some major work, some road construction, this is the sort of accompanying program that comes along with contracts recently signed between the 2 partners. But for Chad's authorities, China offers another advantage: absolute non-interference in the country's politics, unlike its Western competitors. The financial aid offered by the West via the World Bank is dependent upon the application of certain rules, respect for transparency and democracy, and allocation of the majority of petrol revenue to fight against poverty. This is not the case with China. Public works and loans are carried out without asking anything in return, and at the most competitive prices.
The Chinese have a form of cooperation they call win-win, that is mutually advantageous, unconditional, and respectful of state sovereignty. As for Western countries, of course, it's linked to political conditions and demands for good governance. I don't mean that we're not concerned by the good governance of our country, democratizing our society, but what's unhealthy in cooperation with Western countries is that the political demands are sometimes, let's say, abusive. They're used as a form of pressure on states more than as a sincere means of strengthening, of improving the situation in the countries.
Until now, under the control of the West, a large part of Chadian oil will henceforth be flowing towards China. For a year now, Beijing, through CNPC, has been carrying out major prospecting in the west of the country. The oil fields look promising. Today, militancy is getting organized. Activists are joining the GRAMP, the Alternate Research and Petrol Monitoring Group, to make sure that local populations benefit from petrol revenues as they were promised. Their representatives have had the opportunity to meet with the Chinese prospectors from the CNPC.
For the Chinese, the lecture is quite clear. They say, we're coming into African countries in order to invest. We're not going to get involved in the country's internal politics. We're dealing with sovereign states. How are you supposed to take that? We as Africans, we said, okay. At the same time, the Western companies come with their governments behind them and with their human rights and democratic conditions in their speeches. But in practice, these Western states continue to support, either actively or passively, non-democratic regimes. What we can see from the Chinese is an honest line. They say, no, we're not going to impose any conditions. We're not going to make demands for human rights, for democracy, or anything else. As far as we're concerned, we're here to do business. That's it. At least it's very clear.
Today, two activists are in the Doba area to meet with villagers in the south of the country where larger oil fields exist. Ngalabe is a village in the heart of one of Chad's largest oil deposits, an oil field still controlled by Western companies, principally Esso. Chinese companies also intend to establish themselves in the region very soon. Here there's little or no sign of the fabulous financial windfall from oil that's supposed to benefit the local populations. Ngalaba is an encircled village surrounded by oil installations which pass right through it. They promised to build schools. They promised to build water towers. They even promised to build good roads. The Chinese also promised to build clinics, but up to now, there's nothing. You've got to travel kilometers. You've got to go 11 kilometers for medical care. But they promised that when the oil would be exploited, we'd be comfortable here.
Despite current legislation, the oil companies trample over the interest of populations. The Chinese companies have no consideration for protecting the environment. They only deal with the governments, and they don't come and meet the inhabitants. We're very much afraid that when these companies will be here, the situation for peasants in the oil zones will get worse.
Considering the growing instability of the Middle East and of Africa, China is also turning towards another region of the world, also particularly rich in oil, Latin America. After two unsuccessful coup d'etat attempts, Hugo Chavez managed to come to power in Venezuela by the legal route. Elected by a large majority in 1998, triumphantly re-elected in 2006, he is the bête noire of the American government. who fear his loudly proclaimed political orientation and rhetoric against American imperialism will spread through all of Latin America. But Chavez has a powerful weapon. His oil, to this day, is one of the world's largest sources.
The country suffered greatly, with an unacceptable level of poverty. Out of 25 million inhabitants, 40% were living in poverty. 1,400,000 adults couldn't read or write. There was a very high percentage of the population with no access to education, health services, or a normal diet. Therefore, this wealth linked to oil must primarily reduce the inequalities existing here in Venezuela.
What's in the news today is the first Latin American Energy Summit. We're on Margarita Island off the Venezuelan coast. On the agenda, cooperation among Latin American countries and the will, as underlined by Venezuela, to free themselves from the United States, up until now the major oil buyer in the region. In this context, the tremendous Chinese appetite for oil is a central issue for a large part of the discussions.
China represents an important component in the politics of diversifying our oil market. It consists of projects of great scope, among which the objective of providing 1 million barrels of oil per day for China by 2012.
1 million barrels of oil per day, 15% of China's present consumption. At that rate, 1/3 of Venezuelan production will soon be absorbed by China. In his battle for what he calls 21st century socialism, Hugo Chavez knows he's playing for high stakes. He can't burn all his bridges with the United States, the world's greatest energy buyer, but China is one of the trump cards in his strategy to develop new international alliances.
President Chavez wants to do many things, like ameliorate the living conditions for the needy and social conditions in general, rationalize the national economic structure to reduce dependence upon foreign nations. China, on the governmental as well as on the business level, is sensitive to President Chavez's concerns.
With the spectacular rise in the price of oil, new technologies have appeared to exploit even the least profitable deposits. This is the case of heavy oil, which needs a complex and expensive treatment before becoming marketable. Venezuela has the largest reserves of it in the world. In the last 2 years, China has become one of the most important players in the sector, especially in the Orinoco Valley.
Our two countries hope to increase their cooperation in 3 steps. First, to enlarge the CNPC's activities in the Orinoco Valley. Then, to construct refineries in China to receive and treat its production. And finally, to create a shared fleet, and for that to set up a joint company. That's the idea in general.
Washington takes a dim view of this rapprochement. Until President Chavez came into power, Venezuela was a loyal ally of the United States. Today, tensions run high between the two countries.
Venezuela is presenting a more and more challenging problem for all of us, I think. The leadership there and President Chavez has a very clear socialist orientation and a tendency to use its oil resources capriciously. That is, to do things that will damage countries, such as the United States, that it simply doesn't agree with politically. So I think we're going to face a growing problem due to the politicization of the supply of oil from Venezuela. And all of us need to cooperate more to try to influence a change in Mr. Chavez's behavior, but it could get out of hand.
Si eso llegara a ocurrir, sepa el pueblo de los Estados Unidos que lamentablemente ni una gota de petróleo les llegará desde Venezuela. Ni una gota de petróleo más.
My job is to observe the situation and inform Beijing. I have no desire to interfere in the problems or the tricky topics between Venezuela and the United States. I think they are both intelligent enough to solve their own problems.
The United States is the world's largest energy consumer. Alone, it consumes 1/4 of the planet's available oil. Since the end of the Cold War, the country has benefited from its position as the unique superpower in order to lock up its oil supremacy. A supremacy more and more contested by China, which has become, over the past few years, one of the world's fastest-growing economies.
Today, the United States is the #1 consumer of energy in the world, but the estimates that we're seeing now is that China will surpass the United States within the next 2 or 3 years. The more that China grows, the bigger their economy becomes, and that's a threat to our position in terms of market share and our ability to produce in this country. So it does have an impact, but energy is directly related to how fast your economy is growing. If you're not using energy, then you don't have an economy. You're not producing anything. We do consume a lot of energy, but we also provide and produce a lot of things that go into the world economy and produce for our own people here at home.
Although it imports 2/3 of its oil needs, the United States remains the world's 3rd largest producer of crude, just behind Saudi Arabia and Russia. A great deal of domestic oil is produced by a mass of small, independent oilmen who account for 90% of the wells in the country, as it is the case here in Kern County, California, one of the oldest oil-producing regions in the United States. Chris Hall is one of these independent producers, as was his father and his grandfather.
My father took it over from him after World War II, and I took over the reins of the company in about 1982. Things were great until 1986 when prices collapsed, and for about 15 years we lived hand to mouth and just barely made it. But we're here today, and we're optimistic that there's another future, more future for us here for another 20, 30, 40 years.
With the rise in the barrel's price, the independents are enjoying a newfound health. They've gone back to wells left untouched since the drop in oil prices. Today, the Bakersfield region supplies 10% of U.S. production. 85% of the country's wells are concentrated there, bordering the Mojave Desert, the cradle of the oil era that began in the 19th century.
What's really unique about this producing facility here is we've kept a lot of the old tools and machinery in place that was being used back in the early 1900s when this field was first found. And it brings back to us sort of the roots of where the oil industry was found, where the current methods of producing oil were developed, and they're in application around the world today. The one thing that we are very much aware of, and had been predicted, was that the increase in consumption by China was what brought the supply and demand into balance and yes, caused prices to go up. If it hadn't been for higher prices, we would have been out of business. As an independent producer in the U.S., I don't see the Chinese producer as a competitor. I'm more focused on our local market and what we were doing. If he were producing in a field next door, if they'd bought Unocal, then I would see them more as maybe as a competitor. But right now, I don't see that.
The year 2005 was a turning point in the oil battle. At that time, Chinese thirst was such that Beijing risked everything to set itself up as a major oil producer by launching the conquest of one of the leading lights of the American oil industry, Unocal. The third Chinese group, Snook, launched a takeover bid for the California company. Without any second thoughts, China went off boldly hunting on American land, believing that international finance rules were in play. And up came a shield, as demanded by American politicians who saw a serious threat to the country's vital interests. Unocal was bought by Chevron and for a lower price.
Mr. Chairman, we are dealing here not in any reasonable sense with a takeover attempt by one corporation of another. We are dealing with a takeover attempt by the most powerful communist dictatorship in the world, attempting to take over an American corporation.
Congress was in the middle of writing an energy bill that was trying to focus on creating more domestic energy, having greater control over our own future. And in the middle of actually writing that bill, we heard, and it heard in the papers, and it began to come across on the wires that the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company had placed a bid for a major U.S. oil producer. And obviously, when it comes to controlling our own future, having a Chinese-owned company take over one of our major producers was a threat to us. And the more we looked at it, we began to realize that certain technology that was owned by Unocal, that dealt with deep water drilling, that dealt with sonar testing, a lot of the things that had dual use, things that could be used in oil and gas production, but also had a military component to it. Those technologies were owned by Unocal.
After days and nights of discussion in the offices of the American Congressional Investigation Committee, the Chinese were forced to give up.
The problem was that it came at a time that there was already a very strong suspicion about China's expansion. There has been other activities of China in Venezuela, in Canada. So there was a sense in Washington that while the United States is becoming heavily dependent on foreign oil, and it is relying on the oil that it can get from Western hemispheric sources, the idea of a major superpower like China coming into the Western Hemisphere and bidding for the same oil that the United States is so reliant on, that was something that edged a lot of people in Washington and caused a lot of consternation, particularly in Congress.
Bill Reinsch is the president of the NFTC, the National Foreign Trade Council. Regarding the Unocal affair, Reinsch couldn't deny his principles, but even in the country of free trade, market liberties have their limits.
Most economists will tell you that it's a fungible product. You buy some here, you buy less over there, and it doesn't really make any difference. That's true if you have supply and demand roughly the same and sort of growing at the same level. The Chinese buy Unocal here, that means they're not buying something over here. Someone else steps in and buys that. It all works out in the marketplace. There's a different kind of market analysis, though, and that is if you assume rapidly growing demand because of India and China, and if you assume level supply, or supply not growing as fast as demand, then you end up with potentially different market behavior, because at that point you have shortages, and you have companies hoarding, or countries hoarding in effect. And what the Chinese have been attempting to do is not simply to buy barrels of oil, but to buy productive capacity. So if they bought up productive capacity and then decide in that kind of market situation to reserve it all for themselves and not sell it on the marketplace, that would make shortages much worse and might contribute to oil supply problems here, which would be a security issue. For a bunch of communists, they've turned out to be very good capitalists.
Ken Cortese is one of the most influential men in this new business-oriented China. When he was director of the American investment and securities bank Goldman Sachs, Cortese was one of the principal intermediaries in China's attempt to purchase Unocal through its SNOOC, of which he was a board member. As a Canadian, he was well positioned and had an excellent perspective of the whole affair.
It would have been a major acquisition, the largest acquisition made by a Chinese company up to that point. It's not like buying or selling yogurts. Energy is at the center of political life. It's not a completely transparent and free market. There are strategic issues behind every large oil company. The current US ambassador in Baghdad was formerly with Unocal. The current president of Afghanistan was formerly with Unocal. The first agreement signed with the new Afghan government after the overthrow of the Taliban regime was in favor of Unocal. Fields of energy, politics, and economics are all interwoven. Buying and selling companies or even assets in this field is a matter of high political and economic concern. I think the Unocal affair was a wake-up call for much of the world. It woke up America, who saw that it now had to deal with a country which could eventually be a real rival. It also awoke the Chinese to the fact that they were a little naive. As newcomers into the capitalist world, they were just getting into the game. And they saw that things weren't that simple. From that point on, China intensified its efforts all over the globe in its search for energy. Since that setback, China shows an intense activity on the international scene.
Bluntly stopped in their attempts to acquire Western production capacity while playing the market rules, the Chinese have revised their strategy. China has since been looking for new alliances anywhere with anyone considered an oil-producing country, no matter what the politics might be.
The objective of our company, CNOOC, is not only to supply China with oil, but to adapt to world needs and to take part in world development. With regard to our relations with the United States, we had expected, for example, to purchase Unocal, respecting the international laws in force, and you know what the results were. All the same, we hope that in the future we will once again be able to work with the United States, respecting international trading laws.
In this oil war, China knows it will always find the United States in its way. Hence the alliances it establishes with countries hostile to its main rival like Iran. Banished from the international community because of its nuclear ambitions, Iran sees China as an important ally.
China has a considerable advantage over all the other Asian powers in that it's the only Asian country with a right of veto on the Security Council. From this perspective, wooing China, above all, for countries that have problems with the Security Council, like Iran, due to the nuclear question, the fact that China can put pressure on the Security Council is a considerable advantage which the Iranians are very aware of. The Chinese have served their interests up until now by slowing down the process of indicting Iran and also, above all, by slowing down the voting for sanctions which could create economic as well as social problems for Iran.
A second example of this unscrupulous search for new alliances is Sudan, China's major oil supplier. For 15 years, Western companies have been gradually abandoning the country in face of security risks and as a rejection of a regime that seeds terror in the heart of its own people. No qualms on China's side. True to its doctrine of non-interference, Beijing closes its eyes to Khartoum's politics, which in the name of protecting its oil reserves has no hesitation emptying regions of entire populations. After southern Sudan, it is now the turn of the populations of Darfur, living near a major part of the country's oil reserves, to suffer the violence of militias armed by the Sudanese authorities. Here at the Security Council of the United Nations in New York, much of the outcome of the local populations is decided. In both cases, Iran's as well as Sudan's, the international community has adopted a common attitude. In everyone's focus is China, which threatens to use its veto in case of severe restrictive sanctions against its oil allies.
In the case of Sudan and Iran, there are specific problems because these are countries that are violators of international law. Sudan has a lot to do with the genocide in Darfur. Iran is facing world opposition regarding its nuclear ambitions. So these are two countries that defy the international consensus. And because China has a veto power in the Security Council, those two countries really want China to be on their side. So they make sure to tie themselves into China and to offer China unprecedented oil and gas deals in order to make sure that China gives them the insurance, the policy that they need, which is the veto power in the Security Council.
Marian Zumbulev is the representative at the UN for the International Crisis Group, an NGO very active in denouncing the drama in Darfur.
We have not seen China support any single resolution of the Security Council on Sudan, on Darfur, I should emphasize, that imposes pressure through sanctions, strong language, things like that. In fact, China has gone the opposite way. China has tried to weaken various drafts proposed by other member states to impose pressure on the government of Sudan regarding the issue of Darfur, which has both delayed some of those resolutions and has also, again, weakened the language. And even on resolutions which in the end were agreed on in the spirit of compromise, the draft resolution, the text of the draft resolution, on some of these China again abstained. If an original draft resolution says, for example, we should impose an arms embargo on the country of Sudan, China would say, well, that's perhaps inadvisable, perhaps we should talk about an arms embargo on Darfur only. because the rest of Sudan is separate from the Darfur conflict. In the end, we have gotten only an arms embargo on Darfur, which is, frankly speaking, it is a nonsensical approach, given that Darfur is part of the Sudanese territory, and you allow, so the Security Council has allowed arms trade with the rest of Sudan, except that many of these arms and other material, they get spilled over into Darfur, and there's really no way to prevent that.
Moving further west, we reach the neighboring country, Chad, directly concerned with the Darfur crisis. Tens of thousands of Sudanese refugees are already on its territory, which also serves as a rear base for the Darfur rebels. In reprisal, Sudan accommodates and finances the Chad rebellion, thanks to the oil revenues paid by China, furnishing it with all the necessary military equipment. In this way, China, through its different alliances, can put pressure on Chad via interposed rebels. In this context, a new piece to the puzzle was introduced: Taiwan, China's principal regional adversary and American ally. Until 2005, Chad was one of the few African nations to recognize this country. Facing the growing menace of rebels armed by China, Chad simply broke off diplomatic relations with Taipei and re-established them with Beijing. N'Djamena was thus able to gain some respite, and for Beijing, there were new oil contacts. A win-win situation.
The ever-increasing importance of the People's Republic of China in the world, in regards to economics, politics, strategy, its importance on the Security Council, all this, Chad couldn't remain indifferent to China's position and had to reckon with China to deal with a certain number of problems it was facing in terms of aid and cooperation with China. We can find more advantages in cooperating with China, much more, than with the province of Taiwan. And perhaps also count on the diplomatic pressure of China to resolve a certain number of problems which are preoccupying us. It's no secret to anyone, our relations with Sudan at this time, in Darfur, turn to China and make them understand our way of thinking, our position, our cause, and to influence China to have an equally balanced attitude regarding Chad and Sudan, and not to support, blindly perhaps, the regime in Khartoum.
Taiwan is very important to this story because the island has immense strategic value, especially regarding international maritime traffic. And China has a veritable Achilles heel. The bulk of its oil comes by sea. In the event of a crisis, it would find itself at the mercy of the American naval fleet, the largest in the world. And the Taiwan Strait, under American control, lies on one of the principal oil routes that supplies all of the Far East.
The Chinese are very worried that one day in the future, their energy security will be compromised as a result of the fact that the United States is the hegemon in the high seas, and it has the #1 naval power in the world today. So the Chinese are doing two things. Number one, they are building a navy. They are investing heavily in blue water navy. Number two, they are building enough capacity, pipeline capacity, to pipe oil on the ground, bringing it from Kazakhstan, from Russia, from Burma and other places, to make sure that they cannot be strangled, they cannot be blocked if there is some sort of a situation over Taiwan or over any other issue in the future. So they don't want to be in a situation that Japan was before the Second World War, that the United States imposed a blockade, an embargo, and they could not get their oil. They're very sensitive to this, and I think that's the main reason why we could see tension between the United States and China over who controls the sea lanes, especially those sea lanes that are related to energy supply.
In this new oil war, the United States has a determinant key phrase: security of supply. Faced with the Middle East in turmoil and suffering dwindling reserves, the country is forced to seek new oil reserves around the globe as well. Confrontation with China seems inevitable. Robert McFarlane served as national security advisor to several American presidents in the 70s and 80s.
Yes, I think the world is facing a very intense competition that could get out of hand. China, in becoming reliant on those countries for oil, will probably have less concern about their behavior on important issues, nuclear proliferation, support for terrorism, or indifference to the human rights of their own people. And so it is true that China's growth thus far in capturing oil resources has not always been terribly responsible. There's no wish for China to become involved in a war over energy resources. It's a waste of their money and of uncertain outcome to get into an armed competition for energy with anyone, including Japan or the United States.
China is what it is. We cannot change China. We have to live with China. We need to work with them. We need to find ways to minimize attention, and we need to realize that their needs, their economic needs, are the main bottleneck in the future of the Chinese economy. And unless we will find ways to enlarge the pie and have more energy for everybody, we almost guarantee that there will be conflict and war.
Today, we've got half of humanity, the populations of China, India, Vietnam, and other Asian countries, who want to live the way we do, and they don't understand why they shouldn't. What are we going to say? Okay, take more and we'll take less. Probably not. It's clear that the energy stakes are only going to increase and become more important in international political fields. There could eventually be conflicts, but I think it's more likely that we'll see an intensification of the issues of strategic alliances between countries. We'll see a sharp politicalization of the energy sector and a harsh fight for control of the world's energy assets. Consequently, regions like Africa or Central Asia are again today at the prevailing center of the political economic world scene.
Africa, the new center of the world, or the new battlefield? Oil and the bitter competition between old and new great powers is disrupting the planet's equilibrium. Seen from Chad, is oil a hope or is it a curse?
We're witnessing the impoverishment of the population. At the same time, we've got an opportunity for development. But on the other hand, we're losing this opportunity because the money is invested elsewhere, away from where it should be. That's what the curse of oil is.
It boils down to a question of simple arithmetic: diminishing reserves, increasing needs. Two paths are opening to the world: confrontation or preparation for a new energy era, a post-oil era of shared resources. But does the world have any choice if it wants to still exist tomorrow?